Hey guys, this is Dave March, the spy guy, and this is my friend Mark Lardis, and we are going to this is our third episode in the Historian series, and I know a lot of you guys are film buffs, so I thought we'd start getting away from some of the election stuff now that that's kind of behind us and start talking about various movies and how realistic they are and just kind of talk about them. When we were just talking about the movie Big Red 1 with Lee Marvin and Mark Hamill, and we're going to talk about D-Day today. And but in that movie, there is a scene where Mark Hamill there's a lottery of order of people who are hitting the beach. And people are trying to, it's someone's turn each time to go forward because they have to attack the trench line carrying a Bangalore torpedo. And these things are about 2 meters long, at least in the film. And it's like a torpedo tube. You jam it into the ground and you fire it off and you blow up a bunker. And this leads to a scene of a little dramatic tension as the one character refuses to go forward, so the sergeant starts shooting at him to encourage him forward. But we're just talking about how we're just speculating on how common Bangalore torpedoes were used.
Yeah. They were basically used to clear barbed wire and other light obstacles. Mm-hmm. And as you said, it was a tube that was filled with explosive, and then you would ignite it with a blasting cap, and the whole thing would go up. It was segmented in 3-foot sections, and you could screw them together. So that's how you ended up getting that 6-foot thing that you see in the movie. In theory, if that wasn't long enough, you just pushed it ahead and screwed in another one, and then eventually just blew the thing up. I think they carried them to clear the beach obstacles, but once you get inland, they're pretty much useless because, as you said, they're heavy. The Allies sweated getting through the beach obstacles, spent a lot of time doing that. The British, I think, did it the smart way and created a brigade of what were called funny tanks.
Right.
That were, mine clearing tanks, flail tanks, bulldozer tanks, flamethrower tanks. Mm-hmm. Great deal of imagination.
Right. So I was looking, and I just looked it up on Wikipedia. So Bangalores were first created in 1912, let me just double check that. Yeah, in India, and were used to.
The name might be a giveaway.
Yeah, and were used by the local sappers and miners unit, and so could be exploded over a mine without a sapper having to approach closer than about 3 meters. They were used a lot in the First World War to blow up that pesky barbed wire, and it's actually the real last use of them were used by the U.S. Army during the D-Day landings, apparently, and the British had started going over to the funnies and rocket-launched congers, which I don't think I'm familiar with.
Rocket-launched what?
They called it congers, or the Canadians developed Snake, and an oversized application of the Bangalore torpedo in 41 to 42.
Yeah, that was essentially, as I recall, a flexible piece of plastic explosive. Mm. So you didn't need the steel casing. Mm-hmm. I suspect the first Bangalore torpedoes just used gunpowder or some other low power explosive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you have that scene there, and of course we see them being used at the end. It's to most dramatic effect is in the end of The Longest Day, where it's a kind of a key thing where who's the general? Was it Telly Savalas who's trying to get up that hill, or someone else?
I think it was somebody else.
Yeah, I know. Wrong. Yeah, no, Telly Savalas.
That was a cast of thousands, but I don't think Savalas was a big.
Yeah, you're right. It's not Savalas. I'm thinking of, oh God, I'll have to bring it up here anyways, because we're going to be talking about so many characters from that movie.
No, that was, I think, one of the first cast of 1,000 movies that they did,
Mhm.
where you had just about everybody doing at least a small cameo in the thing.
Right. I'm just looking at it now. It's like, see, full cast. Yes, thank you. And there's a cast of thousands by both sides. It was Robert Mitchum. How could I think of him as?
Yeah,
But yeah, so yeah, that movie, of course, really is the dramatic thing. Yeah, what I like about the Big Red One is it's getting to a different beach assault, because the movie starts with the landings at Algiers and North Africa, and I've never seen it filmed in any other movie.
right. Well, the Big Red One follows the exploits of the 1st Infantry Division,
Mm-hmm.
which has as its patch a red one on a green shield.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably the most storied American division. Um, the Marines can argue about whether the 1st Marine Division is better, but the Big Red One has a heritage that goes back at least to World War One. I don't think the United States really had a division system. They used divisions in the Civil War, but they tended to be more temporary.
Yeah.
Whereas by World War One, the United States Army had formed permanent divisions. I know the British Army really was based around the regiments, and the brigades were made up of, depending on the era, 3 to 4 regiments, and 3 or 4 brigades were then brought together in a division. But those tended to be ad hoc for a long time. For example, in the Crimean War, you had the heavy division and the light division. You didn't have, say, the 51st Division, which was a fairly noted British division in World War II.
Yeah.
So, but it's, as I said, the Big Red One was the first American division to see combat. Well, let me say the first numbered division, because the Philippine Division did see combat prior to the Big Red One, but the Big Red One was the first one that saw combat that survived until the end of World War II.
Correct.
So, and it fought in North Africa and in France. I think it may have fought in Sicily too. I would have to check.
You do.
Okay.
If you watch the movie, you see it goes into Sicily.
Yeah.
I have the extended cut version of it. That's like 50 minutes of footage, and it makes the movie make a lot more sense, and it's a lot better. There's a lot more stuff going on, and it kind of ties things together. Like there's a character, like in the original movie, there's like a German officer that keeps showing up, and he has a much more role in that movie and than what we see in the theatrical cut. Sorry.
Right.
So.
Right.
Now there's another one before The Longest Day, or after The Longest Day. There was a mini-series movie made in Canada about the Canadian portion of D-Day. It's not. Yeah, and it was unfortunately the Canadians are not mentioned much except for a couple throwaway lines in The Longest Day, and there's a very large, exciting battle that happens with the First Free French Brigade in The Longest Day that doesn't actually happen until like 2 or 3 weeks later.
Well, but you got to compress these things for a good movie, I guess.
Yeah.
That's done all the time. Hate to say it. They're more interested in a good story.
Yeah. There was just not as big a market for Canadians back then, but the limited run one that I saw for the 3 things was actually kind of interesting. There was a tank landing, Ooh, the tanks that they made specially amphibious tanks, and about only 3 of them actually made it to shore after
Right.
being cut loose.
If you've ever seen pictures of the dual drive tanks that they used, they essentially had, if you've ever seen a above ground swimming pool, that's a dual drive tank in reverse. They have the swimming pool, a fabric curtain, waterproof fabric curtain around the tank that's supposed to stick up high enough that the waves don't slosh over it. But on D-Day, the water was very, very rough, and the more typical scenario was the tanks would start taking water, and of course, the more water you take, the lower you get, and the lower you get, the more water you take. And it ends up being a feedback loop that left the tankers on the bottom of the Atlantic, of the English Channel. I think the commander could get out. I don't know about the other 3 members of the crew. But you had best, if you were in the U.S. Army, you had best keep up your GI insurance payments.
Yeah, right. So yeah, so the movie, I guess we should really look at The Longest Day itself, is probably the best one in all the movies I've seen that really gets you through the day. I mean, you haven't seen Saving Private Ryan yourself, as you admitted.
No, I've seen clips of it. It's a pretty famous film, more because of the director, I suspect, than for any other reason. But I have seen the landing scene, and I do remember it being referred to as Shrieking Private Ryan because of the blood involved, and that was actually pretty realistic. I mean, you don't have to like it, but the life expectancy of the troops that did go in on that first wave was pretty short, and it didn't matter which one of the 5 beaches you went in on. So
yeah, my grandfather actually landed on Juno Beach with the reserve brigade, so he didn't see any fighting unless he was one of the few people who got strafed that day. He didn't see any action then, but I mean, he got to fight all the way into the Scheldt, so he saw plenty of action afterwards.
Right. My dad brags that he was in Omaha on D-Day, but you had to then press him and discover it was Omaha, Nebraska. And he was finishing training up. So,
did your father actually get to serve anywhere, or was it over by the time?
Yes, he ended up attached to the 82nd Airborne, and participated in the Battle of the Bulge at the end of it. And in, I think it was Operation Varsity, which was the crossing of the Rhine River. However, he was a radio operator. He was in Signal Corps and never got past company headquarters, and he wasn't jump qualified, so he was in the glider unit and never made an airborne landing. So not that I'm complaining.
No, definitely don't complain about that. Jeez.
Right. So, and he actually showed up so late that he ended up on occupation duty following the end of the war in Berlin, and he had some fascinating stories about that. So we'll spend an episode talking about that sometime.
Yeah, definitely. So The Longest Day really starts off with the all the planning and the preparation. One thing I noticed that the German, I've covered this a little bit, and I've covered stuff on Double Cross for a separate video, and basically the lead up to the war, where the British basically co-opt the entire German intelligence network and switch it to their own side and start sending back false reports to the Germans, making them believe there was an entire separate army group called the first.
Commanded by George Patton, no
Yeah,
less.
so they had to believe it. Why would we have one of the best American generals commanding the Phantom Army group? It's called the First U.S. Army Group, and they started sending all this information to the Germans, making them believe there was another 30 or 40 divisions that didn't even existed there, and they made it to. So those are familiar with the coast of France. You have Cherbourg up here, and in the middle is the Normandy Peninsula or Normandy area where the Allies actually landed. And then there's this kind of jutting out triangular section called the Pas de Calais. And the Germans decided that it was the obvious place for an attack to occur. That's where if they were launching an invasion by the Allies, that's where they would attack. And made a lot of their assumptions by putting a lot of their heavy defensive forces in that region, and the British and the Americans did everything to convince them that was true. But they had Monty was one of the chief, Field Marshal Montgomery was the for the British was one of the chief planners of the actual invasion, and he decided he wanted to land off the coast at Normandy. And one of the reasons they did it is that the British and the Allies had superior staffing to where the Germans were, because the Germans kept having to clear out their guys to send off to the Eastern Front. This allowed the Allies to kind of look at the frontage and said, we're going to land 5 divisions on the coast of any place. There was nowhere in the Pas de Calais for 5 divisions all to land in one spot. So they had to...
I'm not sure about that. I think there were some other factors that were at work too. One is that Pas de Calais, of course, was the most obvious route, since it was the shortest route across the English Channel. In fact, artillery could fire across the English Channel at that point, and did.
Yeah.
However, it was also the part of the French coast that was closest to Germany, and closest to everything else, and it was a very difficult battlefield to isolate.
Yeah.
Whereas the Normandy beaches were on the west side of the Seine River, which is a major obstacle, and it's also a lot further from Germany, which meant that any reinforcements sent there had to travel a longer distance and also had to cross the Seine. And one of the things that the Allies did immediately before and during the Normandy invasion was knock down as many of the Seine bridges as they could, which increased the difficulty of the Germans getting there. And even if they didn't have to cross a river, just the distance they had to travel meant that it would take a lot longer for the reinforcements to get there. I don't remember the exact length. The 2nd SS Panzer Division was stationed in the south of France when the D-Day landing started, and ended up, I think, spending either 1 week or 2 weeks getting to Normandy due to combination of Allied airstrikes and the French resistance. There's an excellent book on that journey whose title I can't remember. I think it was Das Reich. That does show that the only thing that partisans can do against a heavy armor division is serve as speed bumps. But that's all we needed them to do.
Right.
The fact that they did not show up on D-Day +1 or D-Day +2 was one of the key reasons that we ended up staying on the beaches.
I mean, it's a bit more later in the movie or story, but I know that one of the SS divisions actually managed to get into, I believe, Cherbourg, or Caen. Sorry, Caen. And they were just they were stuck in a traffic jam through fleeing civilians, and they just couldn't move that day until they got there, and they ran into a bunch of 25-pounder British artillery pieces, and that kind of stopped their day.
Yeah, yeah. The real thing that slowed them down were the Yagos, the fighter bombers.
Mhm.
And it didn't matter whether we're talking about American Thunderbolts or British Tempest and Typhoons. The Allies ruled the skies, and there was a joke that the Germans used to tell that you can tell whose Air Force the aircraft are by looking at the color. That if they were colored, they were British. If they were silver, they were American. If they were invisible, they were German.
Uh-huh. Well, there's definitely a funny scene in the Longest Day where the one colonel who Priller, I believe, is desperately calling up his superiors to say, "You've dispersed all the aircraft too much. I don't know where any of my planes are. What's going on here?" And then on the day of the invasion, he gets a call and told to go off and fight an attack. And he's like, "Can you tell me where the invasion force is?" And then they're like, "Normandy." He's like, "Great." So he and one other guy, and there are two planes, actually storm the beaches and make it past all of the fighter
Right.
color. I mean, Priller, I believe, shoots down 132 planes in Russia.
Yeah.
And he's and there's some reports of some Junkers, I believe, or dive bombing the Canadian beach. But aside from that, they're the only guys who launch an aerial attack
Right.
on the first day.
Right. The Germans were about as successful in the air on D-Day as the U.S. was at Pearl Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were occasional successes, but nothing to write home about.
Yeah.
And Priller was actually pretty lucky just to get back to base.
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever read that actually happened, and if you've ever read the accounts, he ends up getting chased most of the way across the beaches. He made one pass and decided that he'd done his duty for the fatherland.
Right. The Luftwaffe has had its glorious moment, as I believe it says in the film.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
It is, yeah, it's just Hitler originally said that on the first day of the invasion, the Allies would be met by 1,000 planes. But even then, given what happened on the first day of the invasion, they would have run into 10,000 planes.
Well, they did run into 10,000 planes, but they were all Allied aircraft.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
The Germans were still, even with 1,000 planes, they would have been outnumbered 10-1.
Right. What I find interesting are the invasion stripes that they painted on the aircraft. If you've ever looked at, you'll see these black and white stripes that are painted on the wings of the aircraft, particularly on the underside. And Allied troops were told that if you see aircraft with those black and white stripes, that they're friendly.
Okay.
And I was once asked, well, how did they prevent the Germans from doing this? And the answer is, apparently they did all the painting of all of the aircraft in the couple of days before the invasion.
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, I don't know how long the invasion stripes lasted, because I understand they were painted with water-soluble paint because they weren't intended to last.
Right.
However, it really didn't matter since there were so few German aircraft.
Right. Yeah, so we're kind of skipping back and forth through different kind of vignettes of that day. But of course, the big ones, Band of Brothers reminds me, it does have a little bit of the Normandy invasion. And there is in Longest Day, John Wayne is leading one of the parachute battalions, and I believe the 82nd. And before he's giving his briefing to all the soldiers, and he says, "Well, if you can't take care of your German, you gotta send them straight to hell." And then there's a scene where they basically supposedly shoot all the prisoners that they capture on the first day of the invasion, but that and I have friends who are like, "Oh, this is so terrible," and I'm like, "Look, they're cut off behind enemy lines. They have no way to store these prisoners. You got to get back to till you make contact with whatever's coming on the landing force. Yeah, this is what you have to do sometimes." And it's kind of like, maybe it's kind of cold-blooded by today's perspective, but you know, it was a war.
Yeah. It's also not surprising because the Germans considered or treated airborne troops as, I don't remember what the term was, but essentially gangsters that would not be accorded the honors of war. In other words, commandos and airborne troops were routinely shot anyway. So it was more a case of what goes around comes around.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I'm trying to remember actual instances because I didn't really study up on it, but I believe that the Germans ended up shooting some of the commandos at the St. Nazarene raid. Mm-hmm. And had on other occasions, and that just left troops like the airborne troops, didn't matter British or American, a little reluctant to let the enemy get away.
Yeah. Certainly, I know at Dieppe, the Canadians that were captured that day were treated rather roughly, as basically they were treated almost like Russian prisoners versus regular invasion troops.
Right. Well, part of that was they had the audacity to attack Germany. That was the first really major invasion of France during that part of the war. That was 1942. Now, the thing is that it was intended as just a raid and a reconnaissance in force. The Germans didn't know that, though.
Right.
So they were, I think the best way to put it is a little bit touchy about the whole thing. Again, that doesn't excuse their behavior, but it does go part of the way towards explaining it.
Yeah, so the also, I know that one thing a few friends of mine have said over the years is one thing about the Dunkirk raid is that it gave a lot of experience that helped out at D-Day itself, learning what kind of they landed some Churchill tanks at Dunkirk, and they couldn't get up and do anything because they just couldn't. Their treads were not designed for landing on the French coast, which of course they fixed up for when they did the Normandy invasions, and just a whole bunch of training errors that went there. And I once spoke to a veteran who had been there, and they said if there had been someone said if we were led by veteran troops, they would have taken the beach. And I'm pretty sure, speaking as someone who fought in both Korea and at there, I can say if I had been a veteran troop at that, knowing what I know now, I would have put a gun to my guy's head and told them to turn the boat around. I was like, okay.
Yeah. Unfortunately, those are lessons that you have to learn the hard way. And he is right that there really was no way for us to win at Dieppe. And yes, those lessons came in very useful when it came to D-Day, because for one thing, on D-Day we avoided fortified ports. We did not land at, say, either Cherbourg or I think it was Cayenne to the west, or Le Havre.
Yeah.
We had learned at Dieppe that was too hard a nut to crack, and that you were better off landing on open beaches. And of course, the Germans knew that you needed to take a port in order to supply your army. And the Allies countered that by building their own port in the form of the Mulberries and essentially building artificial harbors. And they also did something called Pluto, which is pipeline under the ocean, that was literally a pipeline that carried the aviation and diesel fuel that was needed. So that really cut down the tonnage in ships that you needed. It also had the virtue that it got the supplies to the beach, so that you could then distribute it. So the Allies put in about 2 years of hard planning on how to get on there and stay on there in the face of an entrenched enemy. I do know that Rundstedt and Rommel were the two German commanders that were in charge of the defense, and Rundstedt believed that Allied air superiority would mean that you had to fight with what you had, and you really couldn't fight a mobile action.
Correct.
Rommel, I may have that switched. Maybe it was Rommel.
I think you're thinking Rommel wanted to beat them on the beach. That's was kind of his thing. I need to have everything as far forward, and Rundstedt was like, I want a reserve for when there's a thing, so I can send it off.
Right. Now Rundstedt had not faced the Western Allies at that point. Yeah. He had made his reputation fighting in the Western Front in 1940, and then in Russia for the rest of the time.
Yeah, it was Army Group South. I believe Rundstedt has the honor of being the most fired German general.
Yes, but he survived the war, which is more than most of the fired German generals managed.
Yeah.
So, but Rommel, of course, had fought the Allies in Africa and in Sicily, and really in Italy as well, although he ended up getting pulled out, I think, just before the invasion, and it was Kesselring that advocated the forward defense in Italy. Rommel actually wanted to pull back to what's now what ended up as the Gothic Line in 1944. Kesselring decided that he could meet the Allies as far south as possible and make it extremely expensive for them to come up the Italian peninsula. And he turned out to be pretty well correct. Another possibility was the Allies should have taken Corsica and Sardinia, and that would have flanked most of the southern part of the Italian peninsula. We're getting a little bit of field from.
Yeah, well, I don't mind going a little bit of field.
Yeah. But the point is that Rundstedt didn't appreciate the effect of Allied air power, and probably in his mind was lumping them in with the Russians, because after all, the Russians had had years of battlefield experience, and the Allies had hidden in England.
Right.
So.
I said hidden in England, except for that whole Western desert thing where they got schooled repeatedly by Rommel till Monty showed up.
Well, yeah, that was mostly because Rommel was reading the British mail.
And also, ironically, it was also because the British were reading Rommel's mail, but Rommel was lying in his mail.
Right. And of course, it ends up that there were no German spies in Alexandria. There was an American general that was using a compromised code to report what was going on to Roosevelt. And fortunately, he got some things wrong just as Rommel was making his final push, which led Rommel to pull back, and the British discovered what was going on about that time and then cut Rommel's intelligence off. So he fought the the first battle at Alamein, where he was stopped in a fog with no intelligence, and it was the first time he'd done that in nearly a year. So he was fighting blind for the first time.
Right.
So, the interesting thing about actually all of the movies, except perhaps for the miniseries that you were talking about and Band of Brothers, is those were all made well before the full story of Double Cross and Enigma were known.
Right.
And of course, after Masterman wrote the Double Cross system in World War II, and that came out, I think, in 1970. That was when they had to start rewriting the whole history of the war.
Yeah. There's a couple of different reasons I looked into that. So Masterman wanted because of Philby and the Cambridge Five, which are there's a group of spies that I'm going to cover later on some other shows. But they were these highlight, and so Masterman wanted to show, we are not a bunch of incompetent boobs in the intelligence system. This is how we did stuff. And also it did provide some cover for Enigma that came out a few years later, because everyone talks about conspiracies and secrets and how it's hard to keep, but the fact is everyone now knows about Enigma, but the only reason people learned about Enigma and the British tracking of it and of Bletchley Park is because they declassified in the 70s.
Right. Actually, they didn't finish declassifying it until this century. And if you think the Enigma story and the Double Cross story from what you read in the 70s and 80s, go back and read the books that were published after 2000. And we should get another dump in a few more years, because I think the Secrecy Act ends after 75 years.
Okay.
So what is that? 45 plus 75 is 2030, isn't it?
Yep. So 10 more years.
Yep. So you got to stay alive for 10 more years to find the real story. What was interesting is I thought that was silly until I read a book about the World War I, and again they've finally declassified all of that stuff. But it turned out there was a valid reason for keeping some of their intelligence under wraps during the 50s and 60s, long after you'd have thought that it had no value. And one was, it was basically the assessment of the German Navy in World War I, which was a conscripted Navy. And it had a lot in common with the Soviet Navy of the 50s and 60s, when the Soviets were building it up. And the Soviets were making the same mistake that Imperial Germany had been making prior to World War I. And the British, the Allies at that point, NATO, did not want to advertise that to the Russians. They didn't want the Russians picking up the British intelligence assessments and saying, oh, this is how we fix that. So, sometimes there are valid reasons for stuff remaining secret for a long time.
I know of one very good example as well. So in the First World War, there was these Belgian resistance fighters, and they got were very helpful. Their story got told after the war ended, and they were having yearly reunions up until 1940, when they were all arrested.
Yeah.
So sometimes the reason you don't want to declassify these things is because you might not win the next war or lose that battle, and suddenly all your agents who are having tea parties every year celebrating all the great stuff they did from the last war get taken out and shot.
Right. That was actually one of the reasons they kept a lot of the Jedburgh and resistance stuff secret until the fall of the Soviet Union, because they were hoping to copy that stuff if the balloon ever went up in Europe
Mhm.
In the 50s and 60s.
I haven't read the book, but I've heard a podcast from Spycast, and they've talked to this guy who was part of the other special forces unit. So there's the Green Berets, but there's another unit like it that was stationed in West Berlin, and their entire job was if things went up in Germany, they're hoping to gum up Russian offensives for 2 weeks. That was their job.
Right, right. They talked about some of that in a book called Checkpoint Charlie,
Mm.
which was a history of Berlin during the Cold War,
Mhm.
and essentially followed the history of Berlin from the raising of the Berlin Wall until the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reunification of Germany.
Mhm.
And they were supposed to just melt into the countryside or
Mhm.
into the city.
Yeah.
And apparently the British were sending their military attaches into East Germany to do surveys.
Mhm.
It is a fascinating story.
Yeah, there's another unit. Due to the terms of the armistice, there was this group of officers from each side that are allowed to go around touring the occupied zone of Germany, and there was no occupied zone for the Soviets to go into it other than West Berlin and poke around. These Americans and British and French and other guys who were from those zones were able to go around all of East Germany and start doing official inspection tours based on the terms of the treaty.
Well, I think the Russians could do the same thing, but they learned a whole lot less simply because the West was a lot less secretive than the Russians.
Right. That's true.
So, and again, that some of those escapades were talked about in that book, Checkpoint Charlie.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently the Russians would sometimes, and the Stasi would sometimes stage auto accidents with these people. So
yeah, as soon as they drove off the base, they automatically had a Stasi guards following them everywhere.
Yeah.
And then they tried to figure out ways to lose them.
Yeah.
So getting back a bit to, I guess, Normandy, we have the actual invasions happen on the 5 beaches. We have Omaha, Utah, Sword, Juno, and Gold. And which I believe Sword's the one that's supposed to take Con on the first day.
Yes.
And it's like, like that, the city, it's an enormous city for people who don't know, especially at that time. And it's like I think 250,000 people at that time. And the British are supposed to land, they're at the outer edge. One thing, it's a slight diversion, is the paratroops land. The British land perfectly. The Americans get scattered all the heck. But they land perfectly. They have their air landing brigades, the very famous hold until relieved scene. Apparently that actor who does that movie was one of the soldiers who actually landed to take that bridge. And so we have...
You have to wonder if he had flashbacks when they were filming it.
Oh, yeah. And it's one of the great scenes where you get to actually see a proper glider assault done in, I can't think of many other movies where you actually get to see it. And you have that situation, but it's just sort of like, how did anyone think I've read an article in one of the magazines we've worked for, and then I think it was in World at War that did it, and they're like, the commander got the directive from Monty that he needs to take the city, but he said, well, that's impossible, and doesn't even bother trying.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
And the failure to capture Con on the first day leads to a whole lot of bad operations as they continue to try to break out of Con, because it's just like, it's easy for the Germans to enforce and the Allies to enforce, and they just do this giant buildup of tanks forever, and eventually they push it through, but it's very difficult.
What's interesting is they did eventually capture Con, but I believe it was because the rest of the German line collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
And oh, come on, it's not Fuller. There was a Liddell Hart, that was it, wrote a book called Strategy, where he advocated the indirect approach. And in many ways, what happened in Khan and what happened with Cobra, kind of serves as a lesson for how right Liddell Hart was,
Mm-hmm.
because you simply couldn't push through Khan. You had to go around it and cut it off.
Yeah, that's certainly whatever I do. Whenever I have a game. It's called Cobra from S&T. I occasionally will bring it out and play it out, and it's sort of like it's next. I almost never take. I do take the side of the Orne, which with Khan for the British, but I just hold it and let the Germans kind of beat their ways, trying to kick me out, and then drive south as far as possible to try and get a bridge crossing.
Right.
But it usually ends up being the Americans do some sort of St. Loaf breakthrough and turn the whole tide.
Right. Right. And the Monty gets a pretty bad rap from Americans as a unimaginative commander.
Mm-hmm.
However, one of the problems that he had was his only axis of advance was straight into the enemy, and that was part of the reason for that was that they were on the eastern flank,
right,
and therefore the northern flank, once the breakout occurred, so he really could only go straight forward. He couldn't do an envelopment the way that Patton certainly could and did. I'm not sure that Monty would have been interested in enveloping, because he certainly didn't in Africa. In Africa, he did just blast his way through the German lines. Again, he didn't have any choice at El Alamein except to go forward. You could not flank them.
Right.
But
what made El Alamein so great for the British on defense was also a problem when you were on the offense.
Right. Right. And basically they did it by starving out the Germans, so they were at the point of collapse anyway. But you also saw the same thing in Sicily, where in this case Monty was on the right flank instead of the left flank. But again, straight line to not Palermo, Syracuse.
Yeah.
Syracuse. And Patton was able to run to Palermo and then back to Syracuse, and at which point the Germans were simply retreating anyway, since they had intended Sicily to be just a holding action. They had never really intended to hold it. But the fact that Montgomery was given priority in taking Syracuse, I suspect, delayed the Allied victory. Again, let's go back to Liddell Hart. You win these things by going around the opposition instead of going straight through the middle.
Right.
You can break through the middle on occasion if they actually, the irony is, if they expect you to attack on the flanks and they have weakened the middle.
Sort of what happened to France in 1940.
Yeah. Although in that case, the Germans simply exploited the breakthrough. And, you had to do that. Patton did that. Montgomery really didn't. He was more methodical.
Right. Which
So
worked for him in the desert, I think, because unlike people like Wavell and O'Connor, who allowed themselves to get kind of take advantage of the situation, but often having to retreat back when it eventually didn't work out, you could say Monty never had to retreat, at least on that area.
Right.
He just kept pushing forward and consolidating. So sometimes it's okay.
Right.
But
so
to me, Monty's great genius in this is the planning of this particular invasion. Much of it is to his and his team's work, but afterwards, like you said, he allowed himself to be the guy to get stuck at con. So
right. Well, the thing is, you've got different strengths and different weaknesses, and definitely planning was Montgomery's strength. Give him a set piece, and he could figure out the best way to deal with it. Once it got into broken field running, the enemy tended to get inside his OODA loop.
Yes, the OODA loops, which is what our one political thing is that I've always maintained. I always wanted to do an article on it during the for Ricochet on Trump being in everyone's OODA loops.
Right.
That's basically what he did during his 4 years, or in the year, especially in that year of 2015-16 against the Republican Party. He just was so inside the OODA loop, so they just did not know how to respond.
Right. Whereas Patton tended to get inside the OODA loop of his opponents. So, and that tended to be one of his strengths. I mean, if you can come to the decisions faster than your enemies can react to them, you're probably going to win. Not always true. Rommel certainly was within the OODA loop of his opponents, but he would sometimes push forward to the point where he'd outrun his supplies.
Right.
So
Guderian's another good guy for doing that on the Eastern Front.
Yeah.
It's like there's 4 types of commanders in your army that you can get. It's like you can get the stupid and lazy commanders, your smart, competent, and smart and energetic commanders, your smart but lazy commanders, and your stupid but energetic commanders. And you always want to purge out the stupid and energetic commanders because they're the ones who will get as many people killed as they can, thinking that they're doing great.
Yes. And
then you want your energetic and competent commanders to be your staff officers because they'll just always plan and think outside the box, and sometimes you'll have them as field commanders like Guderian and Patton. And then you have your lazy but competent commanders you want to have in charge of your army, especially during peacetime, because they won't get into trouble.
It would be interesting to see where Grant would fit into that particular matrix.
A lot of people would have thought he would have been the I guess, yeah, that is an interesting.
He was very confident.
Yep.
He actually relied on maneuver a lot more than people thought.
Yeah, he just kind of got stuck through the wilderness where you can't do any maneuver.
Well, it was more than that. It was that Grant was the strategic distraction. His job was simply to hold Lee's army while Sherman kicked the stuffing out of the Confederates. And Grant was like and actually Patton's command of Fusag in some ways paralleled what Grant did during the Civil War, because the Germans were keeping their eyes on Patton because they figured he would be the commander that would be leading the invasion of France. Similarly, Grant knew that the Confederates would concentrate on wherever he was, and he ended up choosing the Army of the Potomac, not because it was the most important one, but because it was the most important one in terms of holding the resources of the tying down the resources of the Confederacy, while Grant let subordinate commanders, most notably Sherman and Sheridan, do the actual strategic movement. And that, if you think about it, takes a really confident commander that doesn't care about who gets credit for the victory.
So usually, I could see Grant more as the competent but lazy commander, though in the idea.
Yeah. So the thing about D-Day is it was certainly the largest invasion in the European theater. It was not as large as the Okinawa invasion in the Pacific theater.
No, I thought it's bigger than that. The only one I think of that might be bigger is Lady Gulf and the invasion of the Philippines, maybe.
No, I'm not sure, but I think, well, one thing is you have to realize that Okinawa doesn't look like a large island, but it is actually a pretty large island. The Allies simply had more force by then. Now, if you're talking about Operation Downfall with Olympic and Coronet.
Yeah, those were going to be insane if they had actually happened. Okay. No, I see. I'm looking at it here. According to this, 10th Army was 183,000 combat troops. Combat troops rising to 250. I still think Normandy is a little bigger, I think.
Okay, well, remember, I'm talking about the invasion phase, not the follow-up.
Yeah. Operation Overlord. Initial phase is,
Might be wrong. They would have been pretty close, though.
Yeah, it was, I believe it's like you got 5 divisions plus a couple brigades plus a few other things happening, and but yeah, I definitely have to check it out and make sure. I was almost certain that the Normandy was bigger, but is the biggest invasion of all time.
Might be. As I recall, in Normandy, you had 1 division each on the British and Canadian beaches, 1 division on Utah, and 2 divisions going in on Omaha. And you had
each also had a brigade.
3 airborne divisions.
Yep.
And an armor division that was divided up into brigades, as I recall.
Yeah.
The equivalent of an armor division.
Yeah, for both sides.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's like 8. Yeah, I still think that's bigger.
Okay.
But I'll definitely have to look that one up and compare.
So
I think the airborne troops make the difference. I think it might be the biggest seaborne, because I think you have a lot more ships in Okinawa, certainly more proper air.
Well, yeah, but that's simply because of the supply lines.
Right.
You didn't have this large immobile aircraft carrier called England within 60 miles of the battlefield. So
yeah, I remember reading one of the articles in World at War, and they were talking about how they specifically built Liberty ships to have trains on them, so they could drive these landing crafts for trains, that they could drive up to the beach, drive the train off the landing craft onto track waiting on the beach, and then drive off to be used, because they had blown up so many trains in France already.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, and again, logistics ends up being the big driver on these things, and you never see that in the war movies.
Right.
You know, if you ask me,
I do recall one. I do believe they made they did do like the Express.
Red Ball Express.
There is a Red Ball Express movie.
Yes. That's, shall we say, the exception that proves the rule.
Correct.
So, and actually, the more and more I write about history, the more I realize how important logistics ends up being and how much it's ignored.
Yeah.
So,
Much
It
like my
isn't very
copy of
glamorous.
Martin Kreveld's Logistics and Warfare that I've been meaning to read the last 2 years.
So,
Yeah, and we're kind of running low on time because I have to be somewhere in another hour. But why don't we talk a little bit more just at the end here about the Utah beach landing, because that's where a certain president's son commands an army and has a fateful decision to make as his troops land on the wrong beach.
well, and as they said in the movie, we'll start the war here.
Yeah.
So that was Roosevelt, General Roosevelt.
Mm-hmm.
And as I recall, he was commander of the 29th Infantry Division,
Mm-hmm.
which is a National Guard unit.
Mm-hmm.
And it has the yin and yang symbol as its patch.
Oh, really?
Yeah, blue and gray, because half of the unit was made up of units from the old Confederacy, and the other half were made up of units from the Union Army.
Cool. I didn't know
So,
that.
yeah. And it was, I think, the first time that had gone into combat. It was one of the green units.
Mm.
So, but it did very, very well at Utah and got in further than any other American unit did.
Yeah.
Despite landing on the wrong beaches.
Right. I can talk a little bit. I know that the Canadian division ended up doing one of the greatest penetrations on the first day of the landing. I'm told that it's actually has the highest casualties, but it's as soon as they got past their beach defense, it was kind of over. So it was like the Germans just had a forward defense. It was like a long series of like bunkers on beaches.
Right.
And once they blew through them, it was kind of like, oh, there's nothing else here. And they were able to get a good, decent penetration until they ran into the SS Hitler Youth Division.
Right. That one started closer.
Yeah.
So, and you actually saw the same thing in at Normandy. At Omaha, except at Omaha, the Americans got stopped cold and just ended up penetrating that crust of the crust of fortifications by the end of the day. And there were actually a couple of times during the day when they considered evacuating Utah or Omaha and feeding the troops into Utah instead.
Mm-hmm.
But they ultimately decided that they would stay. And I believe that was the call of the commander of the Big Red One.
Mm.
And I should remember his name, and I don't.
I'll look it up here.
Yeah.
I did have the cast for there. So Big Red One is General Gavin. Sorry. Oh heck. I was looking at it. I opened it up earlier to get to it, and then it's
I do that an awful lot.
Yeah. Well, as this movie showed, it had a cast of thousands, so it's like.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they got every big name star that they could find.
It's Coda.
Right.
Brigadier General Norman Coda. Yeah.
Right. And at that time, that was probably the most battle-hardened U.S. division in the Army.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the main reason they committed it to Utah. It also, as I recall, was larger than most of the U.S. divisions. As I recall, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd divisions had extra troops in them.
Yeah, I think they were based on, they're still square divisions. And maybe later divisions are triangle divisions.
Right.
And for those who don't understand at home, this is the amount of regiments. So they call 4 regiments squares, 3 regiments divisions.
Yep.
They just up the firepower in most of these, but it allowed them to have more divisions, for more flexibility versus.
Right.
other places.
They oddly enough, they did that in the first 3 armor divisions too.
Mm.
They had most of the U.S. armor divisions had what was called a Combat Command A and B, and a Combat Command R for reconnaissance.
Mm.
The first, second, and third had 3 combat, full up combat commands.
Mm.
So only the second and third fought in France. The first armor was in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as I know, it was the only armor division that was committed in Italy. The rest of them, every other U.S. armor division that saw combat in France.
Mm.
They had 2 that they were going to commit in Downfall, but neither of those saw combat during the war. They were divisions that were formed very, very late in the war.
Downfall, for those that don't know, is the invasion of Japan that never happened.
Right.
Okay, and yeah, so maybe we want to. Do you have a favorite movie? Maybe we'll finish this off by talking about some of the actors in this movie. Do you have any particular favorites?
Oh, I liked Richard Burton as the Spitfire pilot.
Mm-hmm.
He had some classic lines there. The one thing I hate about being the few is we're always ending up the fewer.
Yes.
Although, and if we're talking about historical accuracy, I'm not sure how much ground support they used the Spitfires for. They really had other fighters.
Yeah. Hawker Hurricanes and that thing. No, I'm not too sure if he was doing ground support. I think his plane might have been doing combat air patrol and might have been taken out by ACAC or anti-aircraft fire. That might be what have happened to him.
But I believe he strafed the Germans on a couple of occasions.
Mm.
But part of the reason for that is the aircraft that were being used for ground support were the Tempest and the Typhoon at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a lot fewer of those preserved after the war than there were of the Spitfires. Actually, the same thing I think is true with the Hurricanes.
Mm.
So, you'll see this a lot in the 1960s movies, where you end up with, in British movies, you'll see nothing but Spitfires, because there were many of them around that could be used for the filming.
Yep.
While you'd have almost no Hurricanes and never saw a Tempest or a Typhoon.
Yeah. That being said, I've often said the true solution to some of our problems in some of these places like Afghanistan is to not stop using like F-15s for ground support and just rebuild Hawker Hurricanes and Typhoons and like give them a bit more of updated engines and use them, because they're probably more effective for what the mission requirements are today.
Well, the thing is, though, you've got the Skyraider would have been better than any of those for that type of a mission. Mm-hmm. The Hurricane it was a good fighter, but remember, it typically, it started out the war with 8 303 machine guns. I think later versions did have 4 20 millimeter cannon.
Yeah, that's when they started getting good at ground support.
Right. So, but the Skyraider, which was a post-World War II aircraft, was used for a lot of ground support during the Vietnam War.
Mm.
I believe had 4 20 millimeter cannons and could carry as many bombs as a B-17. So it was a single engine plane too, which gives you an idea about how much more powerful engines were by the end of the war than they had been in 1936 when the B-17 was designed.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay.
Yep, that's worked out well for me. I guess my favorite character is that when German who was commanding the beach thing, and he has the dog, and he's sent down to report on, like, we've been having reports of saboteurs. Maybe you need to go down to the beach and tell us what's going on. And he's like, reports back to his commander. There's 5,000 Allied ships attacking, and his commander's like, they don't have half that many ships. And it's like, well, they got them.
Yeah.
As he starts getting shelled.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, for those watching this stream, I hope you had a good time going down the history world with us. And we'll be sure to do another one of these in a couple weeks. And I think that's going to be the thing. I've talked to a friend of mine named Merle, who's interested in coming in and talking about a program he does called National Security Decision Making Game. And I hope to reach out to some of our other contacts, maybe fellow writers at S&T and people through military connections, and get that kind of stuff in, and maybe we can start interviewing or just talking history with other people. Okay.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. So if you like this, like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you later there, Mark.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.